They didn't forget you because you were loud. They didn't remember you because you tried harder than everyone else. They remember you because you were different in a way they couldn't explain. In a world full of noise, you were calm. In a world full of masks, you were real. And that's exactly why, even if they walked away, you stayed with them. This isn't about ego. This isn't about being better. This is about understanding why your presence lingered long after you were gone. Let me tell you why. Most people spend their lives learning how to be liked. They watch faces closely. They adjust their tone. They soften their truth. They learn which parts of themselves get applause and which parts should stay hidden. It happens slowly, almost invisibly. A comment here, a rejection there, a moment where honesty costs too much, so they adapt, they polish, they perform. But you didn't move that way. You didn't shape yourself to fit the room. You walked into the room as you were and let the room decide what to do with that. That kind of presence is rare because it's risky. Authenticity always is. When you spoke, your words weren't designed to impress. They were designed to be true. When you felt something, you didn't dilute it to make others comfortable. You didn't turn your emotions into strategies. You let them be human, and people noticed, even if they didn't say it, especially if they didn't say it. There's something unsettling about someone who doesn't need approval. It forces others to confront how much of themselves they've been hiding, how many versions of themselves they've created just to be accepted. Psychologists call this self-congruence, when your actions align with your inner values. Studies show that people who live this way are perceived as more trustworthy, more stable, more memorable, not louder, not flashier, just real. Because the human brain is wired to recognize truth, it relaxes around it, it remembers it. You didn't chase validation through constant agreement. You didn't nod along to things you didn't believe just to keep the peace. And when you disagreed, you did it without cruelty. Without ego, you stood where you stood, and you let others stand where they stood. That kind of honesty creates gravity. Think about how rare it is to meet someone who doesn't pretend, someone who doesn't mirror you just to be liked, someone who doesn't change their personality depending on who's watching. Most people don't even know who they are when no one's looking. They've been performing for so long that the performance feels like identity. But with you, there was no performance. You laughed when something was funny. You went quiet when something hurt. You spoke up when something mattered. And sometimes that made people uncomfortable, because comfort often depends on predictability, and you weren't predictable in the ways people expect. You didn't play the role of who you were supposed to be. You didn't package yourself for consumption. You didn't market your personality. You lived it. In relationships, this kind of authenticity is unforgettable because it removes the illusion. People can sense when someone is showing up without armor. It creates a level of emotional exposure that most are not prepared for, but deeply crave. Attachment research shows that humans bond more strongly with people who feel emotionally real, not emotionally perfect. Flaws don't weaken connection. Pretending does. You didn't pretend to have it all together. You didn't hide your uncertainties behind confidence. You admitted when you didn't know. You owned your mistakes without turning them into shame, and that gave others permission to breathe. Around you, they didn't have to impress. They didn't have to perform strength. They didn't have to be on all the time. Even if they didn't realize it consciously, their nervous system recognized it. That's why people felt calm around you. Not because you fixed them, not because you saved them, but because you weren't asking them to be anything other than what they were in that moment. That's rare in a world obsessed with metrics, likes, attention, validation, status. A world that teaches people to measure their worth externally instead of internally. You didn't measure yourself that way. You didn't chase admiration. You didn't build your self-worth on being chosen. You didn't reshape yourself every time someone pulled away. You stayed rooted. And that rootedness became a mirror. Some people admired it. Some people were drawn to it. Some people were threatened by it. Because authenticity doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain itself endlessly. It simply exists. And when someone who lives in performance meets someone who lives in truth, something breaks open. They might not choose you. They might even walk away. But they don't forget you. Because even after you're gone, the contrast remains. Every interaction after you feels thinner. Every connection feels a little less honest. They start to notice how often people say what sounds good instead of what's real, how often affection comes with conditions, how often kindness is strategic, and then they remember you, the way you said things plainly, the way you didn't manipulate silence or attention, the way you didn't punish honesty with withdrawal. Real life example, therapists often note that clients don't grieve relationships where they felt impressed. They grieve relationships where they felt seen, where they were allowed to exist without pretending. That's what you offered. You didn't offer perfection. You offered presence. You didn't offer a curated version of yourself. You offered truth even when it wasn't polished. And truth leaves a mark. Because long after excitement fades, long after appearances change, long after charm wears thin, the nervous system remembers how it felt to be around someone real. That feeling becomes a reference point, and once someone has experienced authenticity, everything else feels like noise. You weren't unforgettable because you tried to be unique. You were unforgettable because you refused to be false. In a world obsessed with approval, you chose alignment, and alignment doesn't shout, it resonates. Most people confuse intensity with connection. They think loud emotions mean deep feelings. They think chaos is passion. You never did. You understood something most people learn too late. That real connection doesn't feel like anxiety. It doesn't keep you guessing. It doesn't make your heart race because you're afraid of losing something every minute. You offered peace, not the kind that comes from indifference, the kind that comes from emotional steadiness. When things went wrong, you didn't escalate just to be heard. You didn't turn conflict into a battlefield. You didn't weaponize silence or raise your voice to feel powerful. You paused, you listened. You responded instead of reacting. That alone sets you apart in a world addicted to emotional fireworks. Neuroscience explains why this matters. The human nervous system is constantly scanning for safety. When it finds someone calm, regulated, and grounded, it relaxes. Trust forms not through excitement, but through consistency. Around you, people felt their shoulders drop. They breathed easier. They didn't have to prepare for emotional whiplash. Even if they didn't recognize it at the time, their body did. You didn't test love by creating storms to see who would stay. You didn't confuse drama with depth. You didn't need to be chased to feel wanted. You showed up stable. That kind of presence is rare, especially in relationships where people often lead with insecurity, where affection is given one day and withheld the next, where love feels like a puzzle instead of a place to rest. You didn't play those games. When you cared, you were consistent. When you were upset, you communicated. When you needed space, you didn't disappear without explanation. This wasn't weakness, it was emotional maturity. Research on attachment styles shows that people with calm, Secure behaviors leave a deeper imprint than those who create emotional highs and lows. Why? Because the brain bonds more strongly to what feels safe over time. Chaos burns bright, but it burns out. Peace lasts. You didn't demand constant attention. You didn't monitor every message. You didn't make love feel like an exam someone could fail at any moment. You trusted, and trust changes the dynamic. People around you didn't feel watched or controlled. They felt free to be imperfect, free to have a bad day without it turning into a crisis. You didn't interpret silence as rejection. You didn't assume distance meant abandonment. You gave space without punishment. That's not common. Most people react to fear by tightening their grip. They call it love, but it's really anxiety. You didn't love that way. You understood that closeness doesn't come from pressure. It comes from safety. Real life examples prove this again and again. Couples therapists often observe that partners who remain calm during conflict are remembered more positively, even after breakups. Because when emotions settle, people recall who made them feel understood, not overwhelmed. You were that person. You didn't flood the relationship with chaos to keep it alive. You allowed it to breathe. And for some people, that was unfamiliar. Peace can feel strange to someone who grew up around instability. Calm can feel boring to someone addicted to emotional spikes. Consistency can feel suspicious to someone used to unpredictability. So sometimes they mistake peace for a lack of passion. They walk away chasing intensity, but intensity fades. Life eventually slows everything down, and when it does, the noise quiets and the body remembers what it felt like to be safe. That's when they think of you. They remember how arguments didn't spiral, how problems felt solvable, how being with you didn't drain them. They realize that love was never supposed to feel like survival. You didn't bring chaos into their life. You brought clarity. You didn't add confusion. You reduced it. You didn't make them feel like they were constantly one mistake away from losing you. You made them feel grounded. That's why your absence feels heavier than expected. Because chaos can be replaced easily, there's always another distraction, another emotional rush. But peace is hard to find twice. And once someone has experienced a calm presence that didn't demand, didn't threaten, didn't destabilize, everything else feels louder, harsher, less humane. You were the quiet in their noise, the steady ground in their storm. Even if they didn't understand it then, their nervous system remembers it now, and that memory doesn't fade easily. Most people think love means disappearing. They believe devotion requires self-erasure. They're taught quietly and repeatedly that if you care enough, you should bend, adjust, sacrifice, and keep sacrificing until there's almost nothing left of you. You never learned love that way. You understood something deeper, that real love doesn't ask you to abandon yourself. It asks you to bring yourself fully, honestly, without apology. You didn't shrink to be chosen. You didn't trade your voice for harmony. You didn't silence your needs just to keep the connection alive. You stayed present without vanishing. When you loved, you showed up. But you didn't orbit someone else's life as if your own had stopped mattering. You still had your work, your interests, your people, your sense of direction, and that balance changed everything. People often confuse boundaries with distance. They think having limits means you don't care enough. But boundaries aren't walls. They're proof that you know where you end and someone else begins. Psychology supports this. Studies on healthy attachment show that individuals who maintain a strong sense of self in relationships are perceived as more attractive and more respected over time, not because they withhold love, but because they don't give it at the cost of their identity. You didn't give love to escape yourself. You gave love as an extension of who you already were. That's rare. You listened deeply, but you didn't abandon your intuition. You compromised, but you didn't betray your values. You supported, but you didn't rescue. You didn't make someone else your entire world and then resent them for it later. You kept your center. That kind of love feels different to receive. It doesn't come with pressure. It doesn't come with silent expectations. It doesn't come with the unspoken demand of, I gave you everything, now don't leave. You never loved like that. You loved freely, not desperately. You didn't monitor every reaction, searching for reassurance. You didn't measure your worth by how quickly you were responded to. You didn't treat attention as oxygen. You knew who you were before the relationship, and you stayed that person inside it. For many people, this was unfamiliar. They were used to love that clung, love that fused, love that confused need with intimacy. So when they met someone who could love deeply and still stand on their own feet, it unsettled them. Because your presence didn't say, I need you to complete me. It said, I choose you, but I don't disappear without you. That's powerful. Real life relationship research shows that people often take secure, self-anchored partners for granted in the moment, only to recognize their value later. Why? Because secure love doesn't create urgency. It doesn't trigger panic. It doesn't keep adrenaline high. It feels steady, and steady can be mistaken for replaceable until it's gone. You didn't lose yourself trying to be everything. You didn't shift to meet every expectation. You didn't perform endless emotional labor just to keep peace. You knew when to say no. You knew when to step back. You knew when something crossed a line. And you didn't apologize for having standards. That doesn't mean you were cold. You were warm, but warmth with structure. You gave affection without attachment to outcomes. You cared without controlling. When things were good, you enjoyed them fully. When things were hard, you didn't collapse into fear. You didn't stay in situations that asked you to abandon your dignity. You didn't beg for clarity. You didn't barter your self-respect for crumbs of attention. That kind of self-respect is quiet, but it's unforgettable. Because most people don't realize how rare it is until they lose it. They remember how you didn't argue just to be right, how you didn't cling during uncertainty, how you could sit with discomfort without making it destructive. They remember how you could be close without being consumed. And later, when they encounter relationships that feel heavy, demanding, or draining, the contrast becomes clear. They start to understand that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. That closeness doesn't have to cost identity. That connection doesn't require self-abandonment. That understanding often comes too late. You didn't love from emptiness. You loved from fullness. You didn't look to someone else to define you. You brought definition with you. And that left a mark. Because when someone experiences love that doesn't erase itself, they feel respected, even if they don't know how to receive it yet. You showed them a version of love that was strong without being loud, deep without being desperate, committed without being controlling. That kind of love changes people. Even if they walk away, they carry it with them. They measure every future connection against the way you loved, without losing yourself. And most of the time, nothing else quite compares. Most people leave loudly. They leave with explanations, accusations, long messages sent too late at night, words sharpened by pain. They want to be understood. They want to be validated. They want the other person to feel what they feel. You didn't. You understood something most people never do. That dignity is not about winning the final conversation. It's about knowing when the conversation is no longer worth your peace. When it became clear that staying would cost you yourself, you chose something harder than fighting. You chose to walk away without tearing the room apart on your way out. That takes strength. You didn't slam doors. You didn't list every wrong that had ever been done to you. You didn't try to rewrite history just to come out looking innocent. You accepted what was, not because it didn't hurt, but because you respected yourself too much to beg someone to see what they were no longer willing to see. Most people think dignity looks passive. They're wrong. Dignity is restraint. It's knowing you could say everything and choosing silence instead. It's having the power to wound back and refusing to use it. You felt the loss fully. You just didn't turn your pain into a performance. You didn't chase closure through endless conversations that went nowhere. You didn't demand answers from someone who had already shown you who they were. You didn't keep reopening the wound just to prove how deeply you were hurt. You understood that some answers don't bring peace. They just keep you tied to a moment that's already passed. Psychologists talk about something called emotional self-regulation, the ability to experience intense emotion without letting it dictate behavior. People who can do this recover faster, heal deeper, and leave a lasting impression, because when someone expects chaos and receives calm, it stays with them. You didn't collapse. You didn't self-destruct. You didn't try to make them regret losing you by becoming bitter. You let the loss shape you quietly. That's why your absence felt different. You didn't haunt them with messages. You didn't check in just to see how they were doing. You didn't linger at the edge of their life, half gone, half waiting. When you left clean. And that's rare. Most people leave pieces of themselves behind, unspoken expectations, unresolved emotions, invisible strings. You cut the cord with care, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself to stop bleeding in the same place. There's a particular weight to someone who leaves without begging to be chosen. It forces the other person to sit with their own choices, without distraction. No drama to blame. No explosion to point at and say, that's why it ended. Just quiet. And quiet leaves space for reflection. Real life relationship studies show that people replay relationships more intensely when the ending lacks chaos. The mind fills the silence with questions, with memories, with contrast. They remember how you didn't try to convince them to stay, how you didn't threaten to leave if things didn't change. You simply left when they didn't. They remember the look in your eyes when you realized it was time. Not anger, not desperation. Clarity. You didn't leave to punish. You didn't leave to prove a point. You left because staying would have meant abandoning your self-respect. And self-respect is something you never negotiated. You didn't turn the ending into a public spectacle. You didn't drag mutual friends into choosing sides. You didn't rewrite the story to make yourself the hero and them the villain. You let the truth stand on its own. That kind of restraint confuses people at first. They expect anger. They expect emotional chaos. They expect you to fall apart. And when you don't, it unsettles them. Because dignity removes the illusion that they were your only source of stability. You proved, without saying a word, that you could stand on your own. You grieved privately. You healed quietly. You rebuilt without broadcasting the process. And that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength without the need for witnesses. Later, when they encountered people who stayed but complained, who fought but never left, who threatened but never followed through, the contrast became impossible to ignore. They remembered that you didn't argue your worth, you lived it. They remembered that you didn't stay where you were no longer valued. You chose peace over familiarity. Walking away with dignity means accepting that not everyone will meet you where you stand, and instead of lowering yourself, you move on. You didn't wait for apologies that might never come. You didn't pause your life for someone else's readiness. You trusted that what was meant for you wouldn't require self-abandonment. That trust is rare, and it lingers, because long after emotions settle, people remember how you handled the ending more than how you handled the beginning. Anyone can enter with charm. Anyone can stay when things are easy. But leaving with grace, leaving without bitterness, leaving without burning everything down, that reveals character. You didn't need the last word. You didn't need to be understood by someone who no longer listened. You didn't need validation from the person who couldn't give it. You validated yourself by walking away intact. And that's why your absence carried weight. Because chaos fades, anger burns out, but dignity stays. It shows up in memory, in comparison, in the quiet moments when they realized that losing you wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. You didn't leave to be unforgettable. You left because staying would have meant forgetting yourself. And that choice, calm, deliberate, and self-respecting, is the kind of strength that echoes long after the goodbye. So if you ever wonder why they still remember you, why your name crosses their mind in quiet moments, why no one else ever quite compared, it's not because you tried to be unforgettable. It's because you were real, you were grounded, you were kind without being weak, strong without being cold. You weren't like other women. And that's why you were never replaceable.